Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the intelligent social media platform. Go download it at noetic.app or for your iPhone and Droid devices in your respective app stores. I'm back with Dr. Jonathan Cook, and we are going to be discussing Rudyard Kipling's Plain Tales from the Hills. I've had a fascination with Rudyard Kipling for a variety of reasons. This was really my first soiree deeply into the works of Kipling. This is an early work of his, from what I understand.
Yeah,
And my first introduction to Kipling was actually through cinema. I think, well, maybe not my first, but one that had the most profound effect on me was the movie The Man Who Would Be King. And
yeah,
it's so interconnected. People don't. It's kind of one of those films that is overlooked. I don't think a lot of people know about it. But the reason why it intrigued me so much was that it has all these parallels and connections to Star Wars, intriguingly enough. And it's a highly alchemical movie that draws deeply on Rudyard Kipling's Freemasonry. And Freemasonry is a subject that is a bit of an inspiration in some of the writing that I'm doing. I'm very interested in secret societies. And what I learned from this annotated edition is that Kipling was like was
he
high up
was.
in Masonic ranks by the time he was like 16 years old. I didn't realize. I was just reading the annotated version before we got on here. But that's I don't know how much Masonry is going to be in Plain Tales from the Hills. What we're getting here is, I think, a great portent into what it's like to kind of be between two worlds, to be uh, British, but amongst the uh, ancestral people of the subcontinent of India. And I think it's fascinating. A lot of people, I suppose, have problems with Kipling's interpretation of that dynamic, and which I think Dr. Cook is going to illuminate us about, and he's going to teach us about. I have to say, I'm doing a lesson on Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, and I want to go through the hidden book list in that. And I started reading Out of Africa by
Isaac
uh,
Denison.
yes, and
Yeah,
I'm noticing there's some parallels there. It's a wonderful book as well.
yeah, yeah.
But we're going to be talking about Plain Tales from the Hills, and well, Dr. Cook, why don't you take it away? I mean, what made you choose this one?
Well, I've taught some Kipling stories, and it was always. I mean, I read Plain Tales from the Hills. It's interesting. I just picked up a copy. Probably 40 years ago, I read it, and I knew absolutely nothing about Kipling, and I was, kind of impressed by the hard realism and the irony of the stories, and just how sort of ruthlessly amoral some of them are. I mean, I mean, they sort of verge on the naturalistic at times, but I mean, basically, he's a realist. But he's writing in the 1880s when naturalism is coming into fashion in France. So anyway, I read him 40 years ago, and I was always intrigued by the power of his representation of these characters in British India. So just a couple of years ago, I decided to teach some of the stories. So I got some of the collected selected short stories an edition that had The Man Who Would Be King, and just reminded just how important he once was, and how good a writer he still is. He was the first Englishman to win the Nobel Prize in 1907 at the age of 41, the youngest person to win it, and the youngest British writer as well.
Ever,
So
ever.
yeah,
I believe he holds the record. I think I was just reading he was 42, but he could be 41. I don't know. That's what it said in the.
42. Yeah. Well, my thing, he was born on December 30th, so when you calculate years,
Oh yeah.
it's always a little off sometimes if you count by the actual number. So he's a great storyteller. He's very, a great one of the great short story writers. of the world, I think, along with, say, Maupassant and I don't know, a few other people. He's just a fascinating character because he got a bad reputation for his support of the British imperial project, and he was supporting American imperialism. He wrote the famous poem about the white man's bird, which was aimed at supporting the U.S.'s designs on the Philippines to take control of the Philippines after kicking the Spaniards out. And so he has sort of a bad odor about him for some of his stances. He was also against Irish home rule. In the second decade of the century, he supported keeping Ireland part of England, no independent government there, and he was he's friends of Cecil Rhodes. He used to go down to South Africa to spend part of the year with his family in the beginning of the century, 20th century. So despite all this, he's still he comes out looking better in certain other political situations. I mean, he was passionately against German militarism in World War I, passionately against the rise of Hitler. His own son John was killed in World War I. He kind of, his son didn't have very good eyesight, and Kipling pulled all these strings to get him into the army. He wanted to join the Navy, but he couldn't go in. So the father used his connections to get him in the army, and then of course he dies not long after he shows up on the battlefields of France. So anyway, and Kipling, a lot of people don't realize just how versatile he was as a writer. He wrote lots of short fiction. He wrote 4 novels.
He wrote children's books.
Children's books, yeah. Everyone knows the Jungle Books and the Just So stories. They're wonderful children's books, and he also he wrote some good travel sketches and nonfiction. So he's got a huge bibliography.
I don't know if you might have already said this, and some very important poetry.
And poetry, yeah, exactly.
Mandalay.
Road to Mandalay, yeah. And
yeah.
some of his poems are among the best known in the world.
Right.
So, he's still read, I think, by a lot of people, but not, he's not a big figure in just sort of casual reading of the classics.
He's buried, there's a little bit of a Kubrickian breadcrumb to Rudyard Kipling in The Shining. When,
oh, really?
Jack makes an allusion to the white man's burden poem.
Yeah. And the interesting thing was, he married an American woman, and they lived in Vermont for 6 years, from 1892 to 1898. And he would have stayed in the U.S. probably as a writer. He loved Vermont, didn't mind the cold weather in the winters. But his brother-in-law, his wife's brother, was a drunk, and met him on the streets of Brattleboro and had words with him, and Kipling was so pissed off at having to live around this guy that he went back to England with his wife and settled there.
Kipling, I didn't realize how much Kipling got around. Apparently, he had a friendship with Mark Twain.
Mark Twain, yeah.
And then did Henry James?
Henry James gave his wife as a bride at the wedding ceremony.
Yeah, that's wild.
In London, yeah. He was respected by a lot of the well-known writers, but of course he wasn't around as much as people like H.G. Wells. He was, first of all, he was in India until 1889, In the 1880s, basically, he's in India. First, he goes there as a 16-year-old, 15, 16-year-old, after being born there and spending the first 6 years of his life there, when his first language was Hindi, and then he got shipped off to England for about from the age of 6 to about the age of 15. He was given over to this family in southern England, which he hated, and they kind of abused him and did horrible things and sort of psychologically mistreated them. He and his sister Alice. And then he went to the United Services College as a from about the age of 13, 14, 15, 12, 13, 14, 15 to get to train for the army. And then left. He'd hoped to go to Oxford, but his family couldn't afford it. So he went back to India at 16. He got a job as a reporter. And that's where he started writing news for the Civil and Military Gazette in Lahore, which was still part of India. And he started as a reporter, and then he was given some latitude to write fiction after a while. So he started writing fiction in his late teens, and Plain Tales from the Hills, was published when he's like 22, 23. And born in 1865. Plain Tales from the Hills, 1888. But he produced about 5 or 6 collections of short stories, around the same time. He was just cranking out stories. And eventually, 1889, left to go around the world. And came to the U.S., traveled across the country. That's when he met Mark Twain, and then went back to London, met a woman who would be his wife because he was friends with her brother, who was a literary agent and writer. Bastyr, I think his name was, Walcott Bastyr, and then decided to settle in the U.S. in the early 1890s. So he produced all these short stories in his late teens, early 20s, and kind of by his mid-20s, he was kind of like a celebrity.
Yeah.
And kind of his precociousness reminded me of Hemingway, who started out as a cub reporter for the Toronto Star in Paris after World War I, when he was barely in his 20s, and then, transformed himself into a writer, supposedly by spending time with with Gertrude Stein. But I'm pretty sure that Hemingway read a lot of Kipling and learned a lot from him.
Hemingway, I've been doing a lot of research on Salinger, as I mentioned earlier. Hemingway had a long-standing relationship with Salinger, as well. Apparently, they both got to meet in Paris when Salinger was in the CIC or whatever.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And Hemingway was driving around in the Jeep. Yeah.
So you got it's amazing how these people just run in the same circles, and kind of just keep showing up at each other's hotels and doorsteps.
Yeah. Well, supposedly Kipling he'd read Mark Twain, he loved Tom Sawyer, and he drove up to Elmira, New York, where Twain had his nook farm where he would go in the summers to write, and he just showed up and rang his doorbell, and Twain was happy to sit down. They had like a long conversation together. He said
something along the lines of between me, like Kipling and myself, like we know everything. He knows everything.
Oh yeah, right. I know everything, but he knows everything that I don't know.
or it's like something like Kipling knows all that is possible, and I know the rest, or something like that.
Yeah, it's funny. Similar, interesting story, biographical similarities there too, because Twain was a journalist for years before he broke into fiction, and mastered the short story, and wrote children's books. So they probably had a lot to talk about, and
Oh, no doubt.
autodidacts as well, pretty much.
No doubt. No doubt. No doubt. Um, so, I mean, do we want to say anything more about Kipling's life or?
Well, um, I think the main thing that makes him a great writer is that he has compassion. He understands people, no matter what race or social class they are. He can put himself he can empathize with the Indians that he's writing about in British India, and he can empathize with children, and that's what makes him a great children's book author. And so he's open to other points of view, even though he's convinced that England had an imperial mission. It didn't make him a bad writer. He kind of, in spite of that attitude, he still writes well. So, but Plain Tales from the Hills is just the beginning of his output in terms of those Indian stories, because you have another collection, Under the Deodars, which is the name of a cedar tree that grows in the Himalaya area. He had a book called In Black and White, Soldiers 3. He focuses on these 3 soldiers that he writes about in Plain Tales from the Hills. Leroy, Mulvaney, and Authoress. And those are the stories that are a little sometimes hard to read because they're telling them with a very strong Irish accent. Because a lot of the British soldiers in India, of course, were from Ireland or Scotland. They're coming from the poorer parts of Great Britain. So he empathizes, feels compassion. He doesn't always think the British are right all the time. He points out a lot of his stories are about showing how sort of limited the attitude of some of the imperial figures are, and he makes fun of them and shows the infidelities that take place when they're in India. He describes a place called Simla, which is the summer headquarters of the British Viceroy, and it's at a high altitude, and the officers wives and family would go there in the summer months to get away from the ferocious heat of the lower areas. And in Simla, a lot of romantic intrigue takes place because there are lots of women, there's lots of festivity, lots of dances, riding. So there's some great stories about what happens in Simla. And actually, I saw a great YouTube documentary about it, describing with a lot of great pictures of what it looked like with these formally dressed British people with their pith helmets and their native bearers and drivers in this little small city or big town on the side of the mountains in sort of northwestern India. So
You remind me when you say that you were checking out something on YouTube. We don't intentionally do this, but I was looking for research materials to get ready for this, and no one has ever, as far as I know, no one has ever podcast about
this
Plain
particular
Tales
book,
from
yeah.
yeah. So so another first for us.
Yeah. There are some good ones on Kipling in India, though. I mean, one in particular by a guy who wrote a biography.
You mean books, or do you mean
YouTube videos?
Oh, just about his experience in India in general?
Yeah. I mean, it's good background. It sort of puts you in the mood for reading his stories. Because you have to be prepared to be looking up a lot of geographical names and occasional words of Hindi that some of which are familiar, some of which are not. So it's good to read with an annotated edition, but it's not always necessary.
Yeah, knowing that he was bilingual, I don't know how much mastery he had of Hindi, but how that affected the way that he wrote. Do you have any feelings about that? I can't, like, when I'm reading Kipling, I know it's him, but
Yeah,
I can't quite put my finger on what makes him him. Like,
yeah.
it's very descriptive. It's
Well,
not
it's
overly
also
it's not
he
overly
presents a
emotional, but it
yeah.
I don't know. How would you describe it?
Well, he's a participant observer because he's there's always there's often a first person narrator in the story who is he doesn't identify himself as Rudyard Kipling. He doesn't identify himself as a newspaper reporter, but he's a witness to the scenes that are going on, and he often says, I can tell you more about this, but that's another story. So he has this sort of immersion in the art of storytelling that you find in Conrad, where it's men telling funny, interesting, smutty, violent stories together. A very male kind of culture, even though there are a lot of women in these stories, and some of them are very sympathetic because they're oppressed by their brutal British husbands, or there's a lot of romantic dysfunction in this collection, which makes it interesting. It makes it very contemporary, in fact, because a lot of the intrigue was, first of all, finding a wife, either bringing your wife from England or not bringing your fiancée, and then having her wait, which is one story. A guy gets married, and he doesn't have enough money to send back to his wife, and she keeps asking for more money, and she has a child, and then the child dies, and then she blames the husband because he's so poor that he can't support her, and she writes him a final letter saying, I found someone who's treated me better,
Right.
and she doesn't send an address, and he finally gets a raise from his superiors. They give him the raise that he would have needed to bring his wife over, but it just comes right after she's left him. So it's that kind of irony is one of the key literary elements of the story. Little twists and turns that you don't expect. But there's a great range of tone. I mean, some of the stories are ironic, some are tragic, some are humorous, some are sentimental about little kids who do heroic things or kids who die. I mean, there's a great story about a little kid. It's called Todds Amendment, and Todds is the child whose father is an official in the government, the British government there in India, and Todds, he chases his goat. His pet goat runs into the backyard of where the Supreme Legal Council is having a meeting, and they all look out the window, and there's the kid, trying to get his goat, and of course it's, they say, oh yeah, they know who he is, and it's like no problems, and then this is one of the legal council passes certain rules about landowning amongst the Indians that are not going to go over well, and the kid himself finds out what exactly the local people are thinking about these changes to the laws, because he hangs out with he mixes with the local Indians freely, and they are not afraid to talk to him. And so he actually tells, when these legal figures come to his house, he tells them what the local people think of the laws. So they actually change the laws based on what he's told them, and they name the amended law Todds Amendment in honor of this little kid who wised up to what they needed to do to change the law. So quirky little stories like that are
But there's
unusual. Yeah.
there's more to them than irony and quirkiness, right? I mean, if someone was like, well, why do I need to read Kipling?
Yeah.
how would you justify it to them?
Well, I think it gives you a kind of a panorama of what it was like to be part of the British Raj in the late 19th century. You understand imperialism, how one culture dominates another one, and they make them a servant class, and you understand that some of these British are not having the best time in their life while they're trying to do their duty to the military or their administration. And you understand what it's like to have these cultures in conflict. Some of the stories involve native women and British nationals who have relationships, and it was taboo, of course, to marry anyone who didn't have pure white blood, but of course, it happened anyway. And the irony is, there's one guy who gets involved with a woman, a non-white woman, and she actually improves his character by helping him to stop drinking, in a way that the white woman he was supposed to marry, never could have done. So Kipling is giving credit to native peoples when he can. He doesn't have any kind of superior attitude. When he was a kid, up to the year until he was 6, he was kind of running wild in Bombay, where his parents were living. His father was taught art at an art institute there, and so he. That's one of the reasons too. He's a multicultural author. He understands what it's like for two cultures to try to blend in with each other.
Yeah, it definitely made me think a little bit more about this. I don't know how much this is going on in present day, but the emphasis on identifying as an Anglo-Indian and this terminology. I mean, to people who are I guess white but born into the subcontinent. Yeah. I mean, is this something that people still take pride in or talk about today? I really only catch wind of it when I think about Kipling, because he was such an unusual character in that he, was writing with these two worlds in mind. He was introducing us to this world in the West. I don't know if that's still going. I can't think of anyone else who's really like that today.
Well,
but of course, I'm not incredibly familiar with the landscape of literature in that part of the world.
Yeah, well, there was a British writer who wrote about the British Raj in the 20th century, and it was a quartet of books, and they made a very good movie out of it. Actually, a movie series, and
what was that called?
I'm just trying to think. It was Paul. I have a copy on my shelf.
Well, it's not,
anyway,
it'll come to you if
yeah. So he was really. I mean, there were a couple of short story writers before him who were trying to write about India, but he kind of took over the field. And it's interesting because he left India in 1889, 90, and he really never spent much time there again. So all of his exposure was when he was very young, and then in his late teens and 20s. And he was just fantastically productive. He would just crank out stories while he was there working for on the newspaper. First, one paper in Lahore, and then I think he had another paper working on a paper in Bombay. So what stories stand out for you? I mean, just sort of in general plot, the ones that were sort of military oriented, or relationship,
The
dysfunctional
relationship ones.
marriage.
I think the relationship ones hit me a little harder.
And there's one about an opium addict. The
Yeah.
English one, The Gate of the Hundred Sorrows. That shows you, what happened to some of these Brits who got addicted to opium because there was, big trade there in opium dens, and of course the British weren't supposed to be smoking in them, but it happened on occasion.
No, I think I related most of the romantic ones. Full
Romantic
disclosure.
ones,
Yeah, full disclosure, I have a very beautiful friend from India who goes between DC and Calcutta.
yeah,
And couldn't help but think about her as I was reading this. Yeah.
yeah. Well, there's some funny ones. There's some sad ones. There's a story called Venus Anno Domini, which is a play on anadynamy, which is Venus rising from the sea, and Venus Anno Domini means in the year of.
Right.
And the joke is that she's a beautiful woman, and this guy falls in love with her, guy in his 20s, because she's just so talented. And of course, she, at some point in their conversation, she talks about her daughter coming to visit her, her daughter in her early 20s. So the guy who had thought he wanted to have a relationship with this woman, he suddenly realizes that he's totally misjudged her age. And it turns out that his father actually was friends with her, because she's his father's generation. But anyway, that's a comic one. Some of the other ones are sad for the woman's point of view. The Bronkhurst divorce case, about a wife whose husband treats her badly and then accuses her of adultery, and he's going to try to convict his wife, divorce her because of infidelity, and he's paid off his servants to testify in court that they've seen the wife with this other guy there, and so they managed to turn it around because it's a trumped up charge. The guy's just being malicious towards his wife,
right.
And so they they have a guy named a character who shows up in other stories, a Singleton. He's a former policeman. He comes down, does some detective work, and finds out that the natives have all been paid off to testify against this guy. And so he intimidates them into revoking their testimony, so the divorce case fails. And the guy who's accused, of course, beats up the guys accusing him as a final, icing on the cake to show that he doesn't appreciate being maliciously charged with complicity in a adultery, So there's interesting portraits of marriages where the husband is a creep, or the husband is a sort of pathetic character, and the wife is a creep. There's that story about the watches of the night, where the two guys have the same watch, and they're at the club, and each of them takes the other guy's watch, and then one of them has his cart fall over, and the watch goes into the yard of a woman, and she finds it and brings it to what she thinks is the owner, which is a guy, and the guy's wife gets jealous because the wife thinks that her husband had spent the night with this woman because she had his watch,
right,
returning it to him, Anyway, these are just comic imbroglios that are fun to read about. I mean, to tell you the truth, Kipling reminds me a lot of Maupassant, who's one of my favorite short story writers.
Enlighten me. This is the first time I'm hearing that name.
Okay, Guy de Maupassant. He studied, he learned the art of writing from his mentor Flaubert. Flaubert, both of them from Normandy. So Guy de Maupassant writing he's writing, actually published in newspapers in the 1880s. Unfortunately, he ended up dying of syphilis at a fairly young age, but he wrote the most beautiful stories because some of them hilariously funny. Some of them are very touching and sad. And he had this amazing range of sympathy with the people in France at the time, and a great sense of irony. You know, he's famous for his ironic endings. They're, you know, both writing about the same time. Kipling himself read French literature. You know, he's probably read Maupassant, read Zola, who was the big writer at the time. So it's really this panoramic versatility that I appreciate in Kipling, because it's not always the same kind of story. It's about soldiers, it's about married couples, it's about single men, it's about relationships with Indian women and British men. I mean, that really terrible story about the Beyond the Pale, about the British guy who falls in love with the 15-year-old widow by talking to her through the window. Yeah. And that he has a romance with her. She lets him in, and then she gets jealous of the British woman he's seeing, and then he doesn't see her for 3 weeks. And then when he goes to see her, he looks in the window. Both of her hands are chopped off because her uncle has punished her for being involved with the British man. It's just astoundingly brutal. So yeah, I mean, for Kipling, India was a really mystical, menacing, and exotic place that he just loved to explore as a reporter.
Did he pick up on, I don't know personally, did being there influence his views on religion and mysticism and all the rest, or how much of that did he absorb?
Well, I think he always had a sort of a sense of cosmic mystery. I mean, he wasn't particularly religious. He was just he wrote supernatural stories. Of course, it was a whole genre, right? He learned how to write them. That wonderful story, The Phantom Rickshaw,
right,
about a guy who's haunted by the woman that he jilted, and he's going crazy because he can't get away from her. And you don't know whether he's hallucinating or whether he's really this rickshaw is there with his jilted girlfriend in the rickshaw. So he writes some great supernatural stories. He wrote, some science fiction. Actually, he wrote some time travel stories. He wrote stories about.
Did he?
Yeah.
What did he write though? To time travel.
Well, he wrote a series of Puke of Puke Hill was a series of sketches about British history that kind of jump between historical periods to present history. He wrote at least 2 science fiction stories that are set in the 21st century. I haven't read them.
What?
Yeah. So I don't know if that was, a Wellesian influence on him or what. So, he definitely would play around with, big ideas in his fiction. As an artist, I mean, he wasn't particularly devout that I'm aware of.
Do we know much about the relationship he had with Wells or what he thought about Wells? I mean, I guess he was sort of inescapable, but
I don't really know. I mean, they. I don't think they lived that close together. I think they were in different circles. Wells was, he was a sort of on again, off again socialist. Kipling was more conservative. He was a Tory. Actually, Kipling's cousin is Stanley Baldwin, who was
he's the prime
British
minister.
Prime minister in the 1930s. Yeah,
3 times or something, right?
Yeah, right. So probably not a lot in common between those two, but certainly, Kipling was one of the small number of major writers in the early 20th century in England, along with Wells. and
I,
Thomas
I was
Hardy.
I was reading that Kipling actually declined knighthood twice.
Yeah.
Do we know anything why he did that? That's kind of an unusual thing. I remember, who was it? Was somebody else declined knighthood? Was it Bob Dylan? I forget.
Maybe so, yeah.
Do we know anything about why he declined knighthood?
I don't. I mean, I just assume it's modesty. Maybe he didn't want the attention. Or maybe he thought that he didn't deserve it. I don't know. But he accepted the Nobel Prize, so maybe if you get the Nobel Prize, everything else is a letdown.
It looks like David Bowie turned it down.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a couple others. I'm thinking. I thought, of course, it's not going to be Dylan. He's a U.S. citizen. I don't know. Aldous Huxley turned it down.
Huh.
Interesting.
I think it probably for Huxley, people like him, they probably thought it limited, it made them allied with the conservatism of the British, political system or the upper classes or whatever. But I don't know for Kipling in particular why that would be so.
Well, just to round out the list, Michael Faraday, Stephen Hawking, and I guess, I don't know if John Lennon was ever asked, but he declined in advance.
But Paul McCartney accepted it, right?
Is Sir Paul McCartney.
Right.
And, it was interesting. A little side trail there. I was looking at authors and actors that were at D-Day. And when doing the Salinger research, because Salinger was at D-Day.
Right.
Alec Guinness was at D-Day. And Henry Fonda.
Huh.
Weird.
Henry Fonda, what was he? He was filming something behind the lines, or
no?
He wasn't going in as a soldier, I'm sure.
No, I think he did. I think he said he didn't want to be like a fake war guy, and he wanted to really get into it. So, at the age of 40, he was at D-Day.
Huh.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yogi Berra was at D-Day. Scotty from Star Trek was at D-Day. It gets pretty wild.
Yeah. Well, big operation.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of different countries that were involved. But I didn't realize so many. And Salinger had chapters of Catcher in the Rye in his
in
his sack while he's storming Utah Beach.
Yeah, and then he got involved with a German woman. He married a German woman when he was debriefing a bunch of Nazis in Germany. Yeah.
Oh, that's a whole thing. He actually, it looks like he might have been involved at the inception of Operation Paperclip as well, which whole other matter. So,
tell me what your feelings about some of the other stories. Some of the romantic ones, remember False Dawn? It's about the guy who they're two sisters, and he wants to propose to one of them, and they all go on a picnic together, and then at midnight there's some huge dust storm, and he ends up proposing to the wrong one.
Yeah, that was hysterical.
Yeah,
right. He couldn't make out which one was which.
Yeah,
that was a great one. That was fantastic. That was early on, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's those kind of stories that seem so improbable, but so true for what was probably happened in terms of the romantic intrigue and the kind of climate issues that they had to deal with there.
Yeah, people were very eager to, like you were saying, people were. I mean, didn't Kipling himself get propose via telegram or something like that?
Well, he was infatuated with a woman in England who went to school with his sister, and he wanted to marry her, but she refused him, and he finally, met this American woman, who was the sister of one of his literary pals, but I'm not aware of how he proposed to her.
I could be wrong about that. I thought I saw something about that. for getting ready for this, but no, there seems to be seems like the courtships went really fast
Yeah,
for a variety of reasons.
yeah. Um, yeah, when you went to Simla, especially that city or town, there was really a hothouse atmosphere because they had the leisure, they had the sporting activities, they had the riding that you could go on. You had dances, constant dances. All the women, a lot of them had their husbands away, and they organized these entertainments, and they had all these young officers around. So, not unusual for a young officer to get involved with a married woman because her husband is away.
Right.
And then there were the kind of women who regulated social affairs, like Mrs. Hawksby is in 2 or 3 of the stories as a, she's sort of a social intriguer, but in a couple of situations she does a good job of, making sure that one guy gets the right job. He does she does him a favor, and other times to get a young guy away from another woman, Mrs. Reaver, who's kind of a nasty piece of work, who's gotten involved with a young man, and Mrs. Hawksby steps in and kind of weans him away. So that's definitely model on some of the matronly women, British women there in Simla.
Does Kipling have a good mirror for the relationship between East and West? Is there a Kipling of India that can kind of tell it from their perspective about what it was like?
From the Indian side?
Yeah.
Well, you mean from that same period?
Yeah.
I'm not aware. I mean, the only Indian, I'm not really that well versed. I mean,
Sure.
I read a lot of Naipaul, V.S. Naipaul. Of course, he was from Trinidad, but he wrote books about India. Well, he wrote travel books about India, and he wrote about the diaspora Indian culture. But unfortunately, I don't know that much about Indian culture and fiction.
I mean, it's okay if you don't know. I'm just thinking off the top of my head who would be the go-to historian of
British
that.
India. Well,
Yeah.
British India, Jan Morris wrote a 3-volume history of British India that's supposed to be pretty good. Of course,
Okay.
Jan Morris was a journalist who went from male to female, from John to Jan Morris, back in the 70s, I think, transsexual, one of the early...
So it wasn't just a pseudonym.
No. So, yeah, supposedly a very good writer, and I've always been meaning to look into that. 3 volumes of, I think it's probably still holds up pretty well, even though I think it came out in the 70s or 80s. But yeah, I'm sure there's a ton of historiography on that subject.
So I mean, I have the good fortune of just jumping into literature wherever I see fit. I don't have a community of people to tell me what to read and what not to read. I kind of just follow the breadcrumbs.
Yeah.
And I don't is Kipling so taboo to read and talk about? Are we maybe there's good, is it a big no-no that we're even promoting his work here? Are we doing something wrong?
I don't think so. I mean, I think in academia, you might get some raised eyebrows if you're teaching Kipling, unless you're teaching him as sort of an example of negative imperialism. But no, I mean, I think enough people know that he's an important writer, and even though his name was sort of in eclipse for a long time in the mid 20th century, I think enough people are recognizing that he's still worth reading. But certainly academia, there's not a lot of Americans at the college level who are teaching him. He still has a lot of, there's still a bunch of literary criticism on him, and biographies. There's recent books on Kipling in India in the last 20, 25 years. So he's not been forgotten. and certainly due for a revival for a wider public.
Most definitely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
we probably covered enough. Huh? My little dog is barking at the.
yeah. It's probably a. Always enjoy these conversations, and it was a pleasure to jump into the beginning of. Fortunate that we got to have this conversation, to read this, dig into some of his poetry and The Man Who Would Be King, which I think will, if it's anything like the other things that I'm writing about, will probably take up a whole chapter. So
it's a wonderful story.
Yeah, this is a great preparatory for me personally, and I hope it helped you out with some of the research that you're working on. Are you working on some research related to Kipling, or is this purely a pleasure?
No, this is just pleasure, pretty much.
Okay.
I mean, I'm interested in Anglo-American literary relations, so that intrigues me. Twain and Kipling friends. So, but it's pretty much just my own edification. But that's fun.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you again.
Okay.
I will try to have this edited and uploaded this evening. It might be Monday. It might be Monday morning, but I will do it as soon as I can. Thank you again, Dr. Cook.
Okay, good.
All right.